As a journalist with more than 46 years experience, my co-anchor John Pruitt has become an icon of broadcasting in Atlanta and around the nation. He is retiring from the anchor desk this week, and in these final days, we'll take a look back at his career. First, how John got his start. Do you recognize this little cutie? Baby John Pruitt. He was born in Seneca, South Carolina, but his family quickly moved south to Atlanta. By all rights, he became a native Georgian, sporting a toothy grin and a Georgia Tech t-shirt. His mother shared her love of books, and John became a voracious reader. He devoured big books at a young age, and that later would help him land a job at WSB. But before we get into that story, John goes to college. He attended Davidson College in North Carolina, majoring in history. So it was no surprise when he and his college friends decided to witness history firsthand, driving all night to Washington, D.C. to see the funeral of John F. Kennedy.
That event made a huge impact on me and my life. And I look back on that as really the origin of my love of what I do, because there are many things to love about being in the news business. But to me, the thing to love most is to be at the scene of historic events.
After graduating, John tried to get a newspaper job, but lucky for us, no one hired him. An editor was impressed enough that he recommended WSB TV take a look. News director Ray Moore found a very poised young man who was easy to talk to and evidently well-read.
He was an historian, so he had read War and Peace, and so then I hired him, because I was reading the same thing. It's an awfully dull book, but I'm always impressed with someone who has a fortitude to go through all that.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed during John's first week on the job, eliminating segregation in public accommodations. As a form of protest, a large Atlanta crowd had gathered at the old Lakewood High School stadium. John was sent to the stadium to carry equipment for veteran reporter Dave Riggs. Riggs was filming Mississippi's governor speaking to the all-white crowd when something started happening in the stands.
4 young black students from Atlanta University came in to protest this rally, and the crowd went wild. Started beating them, not just with fists, but with metal folding chairs.
John was standing in the midst of that crowd, thrown a camera and told to shoot. He didn't even know how to operate the camera.
I was able to get video of this horrible thing happening. I thought these kids were being beaten to death. The blood was flowing, and the crowd was screaming.
Ironically, Mississippi's governor sang the Star-Spangled Banner to try and calm the crowd. The black teenagers survived, and the film clips hit the national news.
And that night, it got to be on the NBC Huntley Brinkley News. Now, what a debut. First time on a story, hit the network. That's John.
8 months later, John had to leave WSB. He was dispatched as an officer to South Korea, an experience that instilled even more discipline in this mature young man.
John was afraid we wouldn't hire him back. We were afraid he wouldn't come back.
Mary Ennens watched Atlantans vote in a mayor's race yesterday.
Hundreds came to hear Burt Lance testify today, even though the hearings were carried live on Washington television. This was the first stop on a campaign tour that will take Carter to 11 states in the District of Columbia.
So in 1967, John picked up where he left off. Filming, reporting, and sometimes anchoring.
That's Action News, the NBC Nightly News coming up next, and we will return at 11 o'clock with a new edition of Action News. So until then, good evening.
News was instinctive with him, and he was interested. And as a history major, he had a larger perspective of the news. I found he didn't need much direction. He was just kind of geared and natural from the start.
As a boy, John had never dreamed of becoming a broadcaster. But as a baby-faced young man, he quickly embraced a new medium that held great power: television.
I fell into it quite by happenstance and had no knowledge of what TV news was, of what role it would certainly play in the future, but fell in love with it almost from the first day. I was quite fortunate.
Wow.
Talk about a trip down memory lane.
I love it. And I know this is hard for you because you really don't like being the center of attention, but you deserve it for all that you have done.
And we're going to be doing a little retrospective all week long as we count down to my final 6 o'clock newscast will be this coming Friday.
And his knowledge of Atlanta and Georgia history is staggering. He could beat you at any trivia game at all. In Atlanta, what was the story that had the most impact on you covering Atlanta and North Georgia?
Well, there have been so many, Glenn. I mean, and not all of them are good. The Olympic bombing, which we co-anchored, and so many others. But the development of Atlanta from a small, aspiring southern town to the great megalopolis it is today has been the most exciting, continuing thread of my career and something I'll always remember.
Well, I'm hoping you'll sit down and write a book because there's a lot there.
Thinking about it.
Good, good. Well, we'll have more on John all week. It's going to be a tough week for us. Well, while John Pruitt witnessed so many events over the course of his 46 years in broadcasting, one with the most impact was the civil rights movement. As John retires this week, we are looking back at his start in television. And we're looking back at a time when reporters and photographers literally risked their lives to cover the news.
Being scared was part and parcel of covering the civil rights movement. To go into some of these communities where the tensions were so high, where people saw their way of life changing. They were desperate for it not to happen. Inevitably, it was going to happen. And that can lead to people doing horrible things.
The power of television brought many horrors of the civil rights movement right into people's homes. Journalists were sometimes welcomed, sometimes fought. Most had close calls. In 1969, state troopers sat outside Pike County schools to enforce school desegregation. Someone already had burnt down the school superintendent's home in protest. As a young reporter, John was interviewing the superintendent at the courthouse when they heard a mob was outside that wanted the TV guys.
Left the courthouse, and sure enough, here comes a mob of about 20 or 30 young toughs. They're all wearing football helmets, and they got baseball bats. And I'm saying, this is it, man. I'm going to die here in Pike County.
But an escape route opened.
We were able to get to the car because at the very moment this happened, a group of black protesters marched down the street, and they were escorted by state troopers. And when the mob saw the state troopers, they stopped.
John was also sent to cover KKK rallies alone.
I was shooting license tags in the parking lot. The innocent thought being, I'm going to show people have come from all over the South to be here. And a couple of henchmen thought that maybe I was shooting tags for the FBI or something, and so they came over and jostled me around a bit, and I was able to talk my way out of it. But yeah, one of those close calls.
John was a cameraman when he met and covered Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the mid-'60s. He remembers not only the man, but also the massive crowds at King's funeral.
I was not senior enough to be assigned to cover the funeral itself, but I did go down to Auburn Avenue on that day just to be a part of it, just to see it happening. You know, that's been something I always like to do. I like to be there.
During those turbulent and often volatile periods of the civil rights movement, there were those who appreciated John's reporting abilities. Congressman John Lewis was then becoming a national civil rights leader and remembers John Pruitt as a competent young reporter.
When the city could have gone up in flame, the whole South, John, the way he delivered the news or covered the story, it had a cooling effect. He said it, he stated as he saw it. You can tell in his voice, his mannerism, that he was not trying to sway an audience or move people in a particular way. He just stated the facts.
And that is so true. I mean, John, you were the man who studied history, who got to cover history, seeing it being made.
Right. And nice of Congressman Lewis to do that. And I remember him well and covering Dr. King. I mean, the great privilege of my career to actually witness these people and what they were doing and to cover a true revolution in the South. Painful to look at that video of the way we were. But when you think of how far we've come, that's a pretty significant accomplishment.
Well, you know, yesterday I said you needed to write a book. today Glenn has a book
I do.
for you.
You see the fishing forecast we give you every night. Well, here's the entire year in one book, John. John is an avid
fishing
fisherman.
forecast.
Absolutely. We went a couple of weeks ago up to the Chattooga River, and he says, I'm a fair trout fisherman. He's decked out. He could be on the cover of Trout Unlimited, you know, and then what was it, the third cast?
Well, yeah,
Boom.
that was about it for the day.
That was it for the day, but that was a good one.
We'll do it again.
That was very fun.
Thank
very
you, Monica.
good.
And now you have more time to do it, John.
Yeah, I look forward to it. And I'll also watch every day to pick up the fishing game forecast.
Very good.
Thank you.
As all of you should as well.
Yes.
More tomorrow night, by the way. We'll talk about some of the top personalities and people I've covered over the years.
And some of them have things to say about you. We'll be